Okay. And let's see, Ray, can you start recording? Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Friday, August 13th of our programming for the convention. Today, we're going to be focusing on education. And first up, we have Gloria Lee from the Portland Lodge, and she will be speaking to us about grants and how to write a successful grant. And I just want to mention that, I think this is really important for all the local lodges to learn, and even for national, because this is a way we need to fund our programs and our projects. All right, Gloria, I'm going to hand it over to you. Let me share your screen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. I just want to congratulate National on their 100th anniversary also. And it's so good to see people that I haven't seen except maybe on Facebook over the course of the last 2 years. Felicia, I see you. Thank you to all the Portlanders who came on. So let's get started. The way that this is going to look is that Gloria had a computer freeze last night and I had a fight with Mozilla and Firefox. But what I did manage to do was have a few slides that cover the basics of grant writing. So I recognize fully that people on this session probably have, frankly, zero experience in writing grants to 150% experience above mine, which is to say that you probably are educators who have been dealing with university funding for decades and the complications of federal grants. I'm not going to go to that level, but here's what I am going to do. As you can see, there is my email in the slide. I don't know if we can get, well, okay. So it's glorialeeglow968@gmail.com. And if you want to write that down, I would like to offer every lodge and person that's here at least an hour's free consultation. What I can mostly provide for you is to narrow down specific information related to the geographical area that you are in and give you reliable resources. Caveat here, when you want to learn more about grants and grant writing and you Google grant writing, you're going to see that the first 20 entries that you get are going to be ads. Please don't open ads and go to legitimate websites. And that's what I can provide for you. Thank you, Judy, for being my assistant as always. And my email is in the chat. There may be some links that I want to share with you as I go through these. And Judy, if you want to assist me with that, that would be great. If you have questions, you can see the little funny face reactions, raise your hand, or please put it in chat and I will get to mostly, hopefully this won't take more than 20 minutes or so and we can open it up to questions because there is no way in 1 hour that I can cover more than the basics. So let's move to the second screen. Okay, why is grant writing important? Melanie alluded to this, that we need to look at things a little differently. I frankly am 71. I am fortunate to have a pension and a retirement. Not a lot, as most of us on this call probably are. What I see happening is that there's a shift, and as we invite younger members into the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, we're finding, at least in Portland, that their time is spent a lot at work. A lot of them are in the gig economy where they don't have the security and the luxury of being able to donate significantly or spend time freely as a volunteer. So that is one big change that I'm seeing in our organization. So in order to do that, how are we going to continue to move forward as a strong civil rights organization? This is where grant writing comes in. It is more than about money. It's about telling your story to the wider world. More than that, it's about research and analysis. It's about cultivation and building relationships. And it's about using our voices across government, private philanthropy, business, and foundations. It's about all of this. And if we have the discipline to foundationally get our ducks in a row, each grant becomes easier to write, and each grant is more likely to be funded. I'll tell you a little story as I go through this pandemic year. There are private foundations are searching to give away money to Asian organizations. Asian organizations generally as a whole do not participate as significantly in seeking funding. And a lot of that could be cultural, but it could also be language and the fear of writing and the fear of the process. So I'm hoping in the next 15 minutes or 20 minutes that I can lay out the foundation, and then I can open it to questions and experiences. Grant writing can be fun if you have your foundation in place. So the first thing is, next slide. Is your lodge a 501c3? And I'm not sure, I don't have the gallery side by side. Is Munson on this call yet?
No, Munson is tied up with something else. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Sue Ellen, I might ask you this. Does your lodge, so we're so diverse across the country. The question is your lodge a 501c3? I am.
The answer is not.
This is Nancy. Can I answer that question?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, each lodge was formed differently. So some are 501c8s, some are, in and of itself, a lodge itself is generally not a 501c3. And
However,
some of the lodges have formed a separate 501c3. The other thing that all the lodges, the smaller lodges, let's put it that way, have the ability to use our national CIF. Right now, I've got a brain freeze. I can't tell you what CIF stands for. Community Involvement Fund. That is a 501c3 that was set up by the CACA National some time back to allow local lodges to use that for fundraising, but kind of on a small scale. The lodges that have gotten a lot of grant done, and I believe Portland is one, and Houston is one, and a few of the other lodges, they have formed their own, and I think LA has its own 501c3. So some do, some do not. I would say most of the smaller ones do not and are not 501c3s.
Okay, and the reason why I was asking for Munson is you can see on the slide that the CACA Community Involvement Fund, CIF, is a 501c3. It is called a Group Employer Identification Number, EIN. You need this number to apply for grants. You can. The reason why I'm asking about Munson is I know that Munson dearly would love lodges that are going after grants to set up their own 501c3. In order to do that, it can cost you anywhere, depending on how much work you want to do, whether you're an attorney or you want to give it to a nonprofit attorney, depending on what state you're in, and because you do need to register with the Secretary of the State, also the Department of Justice in your state. It's going to run you about $700 to $4,000. You can get a grant to do that. If you are a large lodge and you're not a 501c3 and you serve a large population, I strongly recommend that you go after your own EIN number. That also implies that you will need to file your annual 990 EZ, that's a tax return, and the state tax return. This is just a little bit of accounting. And I'm sure I can help most of you through this. So that is if you have a 501c3. If you do not, option 1, find a fiscal agent. This is an opportunity for you to develop a collaborative partnership. A fiscal agent is a 501c3 that will handle your grant finances, and they generally will charge you a flat fee or 15%, somewhere in that neighborhood. You can write that into your indirect costs when you're writing a grant, or you can label it as fiscal agent administrative fee. Option 2, if your lodge has decided that you do want to go after your own 501c3 and you have a dedicated person, then the board needs to do their research and make a decision. As an example, Portland has always been part of the group EIN, and I know that Munson wants to retire. So that's why I asked Sue Ellen. So this year, we are being funded to the tune of $4,000 to get our own 501c3. And I'll be working on that as soon as I retire. I'm choosing to go through a nonprofit attorney because I simply am not an attorney and I don't want to do the paperwork. There is a filing fee of $1,000 from the federal government. It's a Form 1023. And there's a lot of work behind that. So let's go to the next slide, and I will tell you what the work behind that is. First, I recommend that you do some preliminary research. There are 2 501c3 websites, GuideStar and Charity Navigator. You can just Google those, they'll pull it up. Within your own state, and for the service area that you're most interested in, you can find out who else is a registered 501c3. I did this a number of years ago for Portland, and I just about fell out of my office because there are actually 55 registered legal 501c3s in the state of Oregon. Most of them are not active, but they have that tax exemption status. What a 501c3 gives you, of course, is a tax exemption status. But this preliminary research is also great because it kind of tells you the names of these other organizations. And what I did simply was, I believe I went into GuideStar and I put in Chinese. And 55 organizations showed up that have registered with the IRS as a 501c3. Well, it may surprise you if you haven't done that. So I encourage you to do that. A lot of grant writing is knowing who is in your space. And for those of you from the business world, it basically is who's your competition. But I like to say from the nonprofit perspective, who else is in your neighborhood? Who can you collaborate with? So do that little bit of work. And then secondarily, you need to have a serious assessment of your lodge. Do you have your bylaws? Are they updated? Do you have a website? And well, that's another whole class. Okay. Most importantly, every single grant is going to ask you, what is your mission and what are your values? If you cannot say that in 30 seconds, you need to work on it. And then who is your board? And it's great to get those headshots and about, a small paragraph description. How do you achieve donations? Do you on your website, can people donate through your website? Or do they, I think that mailing checks is probably not the way to go anymore, but nevertheless, if you don't have it set up so that donations can be handled through your website, please at least put something on your website as to how to acquire membership or donations, because that's a plus for you when funders review your website. And then a really easy one for the CACA lodges is a chronological organizational resume. You know how we always do the reports every biannual, what each lodge has done? Well, just calendar that and you have it. you've got a chronological organizational resume that says what your lodge has been doing to serve your mission or serve your community. Little things sometimes that come up in grants. Do you have Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, whatever you have on social media? It might be good. I always like to say, well, Portland Lodge has 580 followers or whatever in 3 months, things like that. And here I'm trying to, how do your lodge leaders participate in the greater community? If you take the time to do these things, they're going to be the same for every grant, and you will feel a lot less stress when you have to crank out a grant in 3 hours, which a lot of us have to do, right? Okay. Getting a lot of, hang on a second. Yes, I will make slides available after this presentation. Yes, so a fiscal agent, I'm sorry, I should have explained that more. A fiscal agent is someone who will handle your finances if you're not a 501c3. If you are not a 501c3, Neil, I see that's coming from you. So for instance, if the lead Lion Dance team is not a 501c3, but they have an opportunity to apply for a grant, then the CACA can be a fiscal agent for you. But we would have to work together on that. Okay, I hope that answers that question. So this is actually the harder part, because this is what I call getting your ducks in a row. And I don't know how many lodges have this already done in digital files or in a 3-ring binder. But it's something that, as a volunteer organization who oftentimes changes roles of different volunteers, this can be challenging. I know it's been challenging for Portland over the years, because more and more our entire board works full time. And we simply haven't carved out committee time to redo all these things. I know, I think Kent Lee, our president, is on this session, and he has been spending a lot of time on our website. We have gone to using after much research, using a platform called Squarespace for our website, because it was able to deliver the things that were user-friendly. And Kent is managing that now instead of a consultant. So those are the things your board has to decide, or your group of people. Let's go to the next slide here. Step 3. Okay, what types of grants are there? Be very clear on that. There's project grants, which I would advise, if you are beginning to write grants, go after project grants. And they're just easier. They're easier to write. They're easier to get. Capacity building grants are where you have to give a little more long-term thought, because what you're trying to do is build capacity for your organization. Usually capacity building grants involve the hiring of a contractor or the hiring of an employee, in which case you would need to think about payroll if it's an employee. If it's a contractor, that's fairly easy. You have them fill out their W-4, I believe, and you just find a way to pay them, which can be manual, as well as through some online payroll, which is really super easy. These are all the details I can help you with, depending on the geographical areas you're in. The operating grants are very, very competitive. They are the most competitive. They are very difficult to get. Those would be grants that, for instance, we need to, what do we do every year? Operating grants. I can't even think of one that the Chinese that Portland Lodge does. Mostly we do project grants that are semi-related to operating at this point, because we've developed projects that are now going into their second, third, fourth, and fifth year. So that means that there's a combination of a project overview, but also it's operating from year to year. Capital grants. If you apply for a capital grant, your funder is going to tell you either you can or you cannot. So if you're looking for a capital grant, for instance, I was able, because of the pandemic, I was able to get into a grant that was an equity grant, and we were able to purchase the van actually cost $29,000 for a van for our food pantry, and they funded $25,000 of the van. Done. So capital grants are not hard to write, they're just hard to get. And only certain funders are going to give you money for a capital grant. If you need to buy something like a car, a van, sometimes you can start that with a fundraiser instead of writing a grant, or be willing to do a match. So I recommend starting off, if you're new into the grant field, a project grant. Right now, there are tons of re-grants available. One, I don't know if people may have experienced this. There is a new Asian American Foundation that was founded this year that was just launched with 250 million, which is not a lot, frankly, focused on 3 areas: supporting anti-hate, data collection for policy change, and education through curriculum development, storytelling, film, and arts. I think of yesterday's presentation and Corky Lee. I think about the many people that have discussed that we need to get the Asian American, Chinese American history into the curriculums in schools. You can probably fund a person as a dedicated project manager to work on that. So there's a new, if you don't know about that new Asian American Foundation, take a look at that. I also want to mention that currently, I believe this pandemic is going to force us into a combination of local, state, and federal funding until at least 2024. Let me tell you Oregon's experience. The state of Oregon was unable to reach out to communities of color when the pandemic hit. They had literally billions of dollars from federal grants and FEMA grants. That money sat there for a while. This is not necessarily, this is my interpretation, because I was deeply involved in that. The money sat there, and in desperation, finally, the Oregon Health Authority issued a call for all 501c3s to apply for funding. So let me tell you this, 170 community-based organizations applied for funding. Less than 5 of those were of any Asian, less than 5. That kind of tells you that the money's there and we're not applying for it. The opportunity to engage our communities in vaccine education, vaccine engagement, cultural exchange is tremendous right now. And I think Melanie may talk about that, because I think she recently applied in San Francisco for themselves. Our organization here in Portland, initiated by the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, was a culturally specific food pantry, which it was so easy for me to get money. We had funders coming out of the woodwork that really, really wanted to offer support. We were able to start a GoFundMe campaign, which attracted additional attention. And consequently, we've been funded by 5 different types of funders in the neighborhood of anywhere from, say, around 20,000 to 40,000 in grants. That's not a lot of money, because our food pantry costs us about $5,000 a month. And I think Judy Lee is on this call. She is actually the director of operations that oversees the Asian Pantry. But that's another story. But these are things that we could have never done had we not had the support of Health Share, the Oregon Community Foundation, the GoFundMe account, various other funders, the Oregon Health Authority. We couldn't have initiated this. We currently serve 180 low-income families, elders actually, that live in downtown Portland, that due to the pandemic were not able to do their normal grocery shopping because they didn't want to get on a bus to go to the other side of town. Okay, let's move on to the next one because I'm looking at time here. Next slide. Step 4. First of all, write an organizational summary. And by that, I mean one paragraph. What is your organization about? You know, in that I include our mission, the values of our organization, how long we've been in existence, and maybe a project or two that relates to the project or two that you're going to ask money for. And then what is the objective in you seeking funding? Make it a SMART objective. SMART objectives is another 7-hour class. It is much harder than you think, but basically boiling it down, I'm sure many of you use this methodology in your work. S is for specific, M is for measurable, A is for achievable. It's not a pie in the sky kind of thing. R is for relevant to today's situation or tomorrow's problems, or solving a problem of tomorrow, and that it is timed. So that is a dream with a deadline. I can't emphasize enough that a SMART objective is what is going to keep grant committee reviewers, program officers, trustees going to the next part of reading your grant. So, for example, I consider this still needs fine tuning in my opinion, but I was 1 o'clock in the morning last night. For example, here is a SMART objective. And in collaboration with the local chapters in Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Seattle, we are seeking support for production of a 45-minute video documenting the life of Asian American icon Corky Lee to be distributed to 100 elementary school libraries by June 2024. Surveys, and then you go blah, 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 blah. Surveys indicate. So then you back up, you support your objective, but so that what it does is specific enough for the funder to realize what you're trying to do. It is measurable because there are numbers in it. It is more than likely achievable. It is relevant since Corky just passed away and we want to preserve his work and his life's dreams. And it's a dream with a deadline. Specific. Okay. Step 5. Next slide. Tips for writing. This is really hard for me. I have so many tips, and I am willing to review and read grants if you write them. This is what I do see. I do sit on grant review committees for the arts and culture. I don't do it for the pandemic, and I don't do it. I do it for social services, and I do it for arts and cultures. One thing, do not deviate from what is asked for. Stay within the word count. We as CACA have a long history and a lot of accomplishments. Yes, we want to share that, but not necessarily in the grant. So pick and choose what is relevant to your objective. So look for sample grants that are online in the same area that you're seeking support before you start writing. That's a good way to get you in the mood, to get you in the flow. A tip that I've always used is if the funder has told you that they are accepting grants, and one of their thing is, what is the impact of the project that you're doing? Well, you know, they like the word impact, so use the word impact in your grant. If they use the word outcomes, so pick a few words that are in their description and carry them through to your grant, because they clearly think that that's significant. And then again, is what you're writing supporting or enhancing your objective? If not, just put it on a clipboard. You don't have to toss it, just set it aside, because you may want it later, but remove it. Because what you want is clarity for your reviewers. And then lastly, I have always said this, and I'll say this again, it's not about the writing, it's about relationships that you build with the trustees of the foundation, with your reviewers, with program officers. And you think, well, during this pandemic, how do I do that? Well, believe me, I've built a lot of relationships online without Zoom. It is totally possible to build a relationship of trust and confidence. Always respond to your emails from reviewers. Don't let it sit. Don't ignore them. Look up that foundation, see who their trustees are, and see who knows who. Program officers are your magic road in. Most program officers stay in their jobs at least 2 to 3 years. Program officers want you to get awarded, so work with them. Say, could you help me? I'm not sure what you mean by this. Could you help me maybe reword this? Or just call them up and say, I'd like 15 minutes of your time. I want to write a grant, but we're new at it, so I need to get some tips from you. They will always respond to you. And as you develop those relationships, it gets easier and easier for you to get awarded grants over the course of time. So you develop what is a reputation out there. They know, especially if you can deliver on your grant. So there's a little bit in there that you need to deliver what if you're awarded a grant, you need to deliver. And in your final report, that's when you can boast about your accomplishments. Then the next time you write a grant to that foundation, they'll say, oh, wow, they did a wonderful job with, they registered 360 voters in 3 months. They're good. Let's look at them. That's sort of the inside story of how a lot of funders will look at things. I wanted to write in there a little note so I wouldn't forget to talk about it. Many of the larger foundations streamline their grant process, and they ask you to write a 1-page letter, usually no more than 2 pages. What is a letter of inquiry? A letter of inquiry is your sales letter. That's basically what prompts a foundation to say, yes, you fit within the parameters of the funding that we're seeking to give away. Please submit a full grant. So that's just a letter of inquiry. I've noticed that a lot of letters of inquiry have been suspended during the pandemic, which is nice and not nice, because a letter of inquiry narrows the number of applicants, but it focuses the applicants. And I think it's just a matter of manpower right now that a lot of foundations are just haven't, that normally ask for a letter of inquiry, have not. I just think that's a pandemic response. Step 6, next slide. Okay. Prepare the budget from the narrative and adjust both the narrative and budget to match. One of the biggest reasons grants that are very fundable and that are very needed and necessary and achieve a lot of good, many of those grants, they're simply tossed out by the reviewers because the budget is not congruent with the narrative. And this is an area where if you do write I'm happy to look at that. Probably within 5 minutes, I can spot any gaps or edits where you said something in your narrative, but you didn't budget for it. Or you put in $3,000 for something that is not in your narrative that you haven't explained. So they need to match. While you're doing that, using your budget, what results do you expect? Show a clear path to implementation, including a timeline if a multi-year grant. So say, we want to build capacity to increase our membership to 300 members by June of 2025. In year one, we will retain 50 members by doing da da da. Okay, at this point, you've written your narrative, you've written your organizational summary, you have all your ducks in a row from the beginning. Stop here and then have 3 different people read your draft. Okay, does it answer some basic questions? Is the budget and narrative congruent? Is there a clear documented need? And lastly, is there an evaluation methodology? How are you going to measure this? What is your follow-up to the grant? How do you know what the results are going to be? I wrote a grant to say that we were going to teach residents of we were going to teach 30 residents of low-income housing in a 3-hour class how to be a good neighbor. The evaluation then is 6 months from now. What are the 3 things that those residents who took that class remember about being a good neighbor? That's just an evaluation thing. That also needs to go into your grant. And step 7, next slide. Interjecting here, a letter of support. This is where right now, as the decades go on, every funder looks for different catchy things. Right now, in the last 2 years, the name of the game is collaboration. Funders want to see partnerships. They want to see that you are working with other agencies, with just other groups of people. Collaboration is a very difficult thing. I'll tell you what it means. It means you have to compromise. It means that you have to spend more time in meetings. It means that clear roles and responsibilities have to be assigned if a project is going to be successful. Many projects fail because the partners of a collaboration fail. I can give you one very sad incident here in Portland. There was a collaboration of different social service agencies to enact a survey of our county's senior citizens 3 years ago. The leading organization on that grant, the board decided to close the organization. The organization was called Elders in Action. The entire $300,000 had to be returned to the funder. And then, after all that, the funder said to the other partners in the collaboration, this was a necessary survey. Can somebody please take it on and we'll re-grant the money to that organization. 6 months more went by. And finally, one of us in the collaboration, and it wasn't us, stepped up and we reviewed the entire grant and we rewrote it for the same amount of money, $300,000, to fund a survey for the state of seniors in Multnomah County. 3 years have gone by before that survey was enacted. So again, when you form a collaboration, know your partner, be very clear on roles and responsibilities, be very clear on results and who's going to do what. So, what I tried to do, and I'm not a Zoom guru, unfortunately, was try to put some samples in here, and I'm highly unsuccessful. I learned that Excel doesn't transfer to PDF, doesn't transfer to Zoom. I tried to put a sample budget in here, but the budgets were too large. I tried to put a grant in here and the grants are too large, but I'm happy to email those to you, any of those things to you if you would like to see more, but there are tons of samples online for support. So here's a letter of support that I wrote that actually achieved funding. This was to the Collins Foundation last year. And if you go to the next page, you can just skip through all the writing. But basically, here's the crux of the letter. Ending with, I hope that you will support this grant proposal to fund a new deputy director position to support the expanding case management and direct services, blah, 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 blah. And this grant was funded for $60,000. So getting a letter of support, it's very helpful. So you can have these letters of support ready to go. My one suggestion on letters of support, if you are the one going after a grant, write the letter of support and have the other executive director, president, CEO, whatever, have them sign it. They can edit it and they can put in other good things about your organization. But for the most part, it is very difficult for the other organization to write a letter of support if they don't know your grant. So you can hone in by writing that letter of support. In this case, because it was one of our mergers, it was much easier for me to do. But again, take the initiative to at least draft a letter of support. And I don't remember any executive director that wasn't willing to sign it for another organization. We all want each other to succeed. Getting to the end. Let's see, let's go to the next slide. Regarding budgets. Okay, couple tips, because this always comes up. For the year 2021, the volunteer hours. So let's say when you're doing your budget, you're going to use 5 volunteers to solicit 200 people to get their vaccine shots. Volunteer labor is being calculated at $28.54 per hour for the year 2021. I agree, Neil, entirely that you should up your budget by at least 20% for everything you do. The mileage is 56 cents a mile. It actually dropped this year. If they allow you an indirect cost, which is the cost of rent and your building and utilities and things like telephones, landlines, printers, you can use a minimum of 10% of your budget there. That's anybody will accept that, or you can put in a flat fee, or they're not going to allow it. So it's going to be one of those 3 things. But those are the 3 things that sometimes come up in grants because we forget to calculate the value of volunteer time. Another little tip, check the relevancy of your lodge capacity to the grant funding requests. So if your lodge annual budget is $5,000 and you're asking for a $50,000 grant, you're probably not going to get it. Usually when you start off with a project budget and you're a first-time grant writer for your lodge, generally go for the small grants and develop your track record, do them with local foundations. 20 to 25% of your annual budget is a doable request for a project grant. Capacity grants are a little different because that usually involves payroll. You can talk to me about those. The hardest thing that I don't recommend if you're a beginning grant writer, which is why I say stick to project grants that are a dream with a definite deadline. If you have to go to multiple funders, use your Excel spreadsheet and split. So what you do is you do one budget for your entire 3 years, for instance. And then what portion are you getting from a foundation? What portion are you getting from the government? What portion do you expect to get from your own contributions as a lodge through fundraising? What portion do you expect to get from another foundation? Keeping in mind that every single one of those has different deadlines and different reporting structures. But overall, you can request money to support a bigger project. The multiple funders get very, very complicated, and I would not recommend that for any volunteer lodge unless that volunteer lodge has had a grant writer forever on their board. It's complicated and hard to track. The last thing I think I put in there, next slide. Thank you for doing this. Okay, I just kind of want to, before I go to questions and sharing, how much time do you spend if you're going to undertake, let's say your lodge decides, yes, we're going to start grant writing. To do your organizational portfolio and keep it updated is about 15% of that time. However, depending on the lodge, you may be spending a lot of time getting your organizational portfolio done, which again is your mission, values, your bylaws, your board members, their bios, your chronological resume. If you have that all done and in a folder, either digitally or in a 3-ring binder, writing your grant is so much easier because that information pretty much remains the same throughout all your grants. What people don't understand is that if you want to be successful in grant writing, research is your #1 and where you should be spending your most time. I would allocate 30%. Writing is not that difficult. Sometimes we look for a volunteer who can write a good narrative. Be careful about that because writers like to write. What you want is someone who can keep those SMART objectives, who can write very tightly, who can write with clarity, and who can hit the target. That sometimes is not a blogger. Your budget, 15% of the time, if you're fairly good with numbers. Your evaluation, 10% of the time. Review and edit, 10% of the time. When I write grants, I try to, and I break this rule all the time, I try to sleep on it. I don't want to wait till the last minute at 5 o'clock. Just remember that computers fail, there's utility downlines, so don't wait till 4:59 to submit your grant that's due at 5 o'clock. Okay, at least do it 8 hours before if you can, or 5 hours before. Hopefully you've written the final draft the day before so that you can review it fresh before you send it in. Okay, and lastly, hey, you're awarded the grant. Just remember, now you have to collect the data and, for heaven's sakes, take some pictures, because those pictures are 1,000 words, because you're going to need that in your final report. It's good to do. And most importantly, not awarded. What if you don't get the grant and you get a letter of rejection? Okay, email or call and speak with the funder or the program officer of that funder. What can you do differently? What did they find that was not helpful in the grant that you wrote? Right. So what you will do is this will become a learning experience. Now you know more about the funder. Now you know maybe how to write it differently. Maybe they felt that you were not hitting the target somewhere within what they were achieving. Sometimes you write a really, really wonderful grant, and this can happen with Chinese American Asian, because of the model minority myth, we may be perceived as less needy than, let's say, a brown or Black organization doing the same thing. That is totally the prerogative of the funder. What your job is to illustrate the disparity and why Asian Americans, for your whatever project, needs to be funded. So sometimes it has nothing to do with what you wrote. It just has to do with the amount of applications that they've received, limited by the amount of money they have to give out. And they'll tell you that. They'll be very transparent about it. And I do believe we can now move to the last slide, if I remember this right. Okay, let's take questions and comments. And I was not able to review the chat. And let me just review that, but feel free to unmute. And I think I'd like to start with Melanie. Do you mind? Because since you and I just talked this morning, what kind of grant did you go for and how did you find it?
Yeah, there was actually 2 grants that I just applied for. And one of them was actually outreach to me as CACA national president. And this was, I think you call it, it's from it was a Health and Human Service grant for COVID vaccine promotion. And the reason why they chose us as a potential partner was because they noticed that we had a national presence, especially a presence in Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Mississippi, where vaccination rates are lower on average. So that was what they provided to me, was a template and some ideas and what they were looking for. But being that, as Gloria, as you mentioned, because they were looking for something very specific, it took a little while to understand what they wanted to hear from. You have to be very specific, like, we will do 2 tabling events in front of an ethnic market in this place, by the end of, XYZ date, right? So it goes back to your SMART goal. So it took multiple rewrites, but as you mentioned, what she told me was that she goes, I want to help you to get this grant. We want to fund you. We want to do this project. So I think, if it wasn't for that, I don't think we would have gotten that grant. So we were successful in getting that grant. The second one was, and this goes back to what Gloria was saying about relationships. So one of our San Francisco members, she is a friend of someone who reviews grants at an organization. And so she brought her to our regional CGM event that we're presenting the medals to the veterans. And Gloria, you're right, because these organizations are very interested in giving grants to AAPI organizations like us. And they were looking specifically for AAPI, type of organization. So initially, I had hoped to use the grant to fund, the regional CGM, but the timing and the grant, it did not work out. And so I changed it to a documentary film about the World War II veterans, which I think is probably a better proposal for a grant because it's more of a legacy, right? And I think another thing, they want to know how they, or as an organization, will be highlighted, right? So, I think I had to put in, like, they would be listed as a sponsor and receive prominent ads, in all our promotion materials, that type of thing. But I think the important thing was really 2 things that you brought up, Gloria. One is that, I had to go through their application and make sure I checked everything off, all the requirements, right? Make sure I addressed, all their concerns, what they were looking for. And secondly, I did have my friend review it. She does not write grants, but she reviews a lot of grants. So she, gave me a lot of good hints on the budget, certain wording, kind of like what you were talking about. So we'll see what happens with that one. I'll probably hear about that in the fall. But yeah, it was a very interesting experience, but it also told me that, there's funding out there. We just have to find it and put in the work to apply for it, right? We might not be successful every time, but, I think we have to look at grants as an option to just donation and fundraising. We have to look at everything, right? So yeah, it was an interesting experience, and they all had to do both of them like in a week. So that was interesting.
So thank you, Melanie. So the journey of 1,000 steps begins with the first step. And I've tried to broadly outline what those steps may look like. Again, I encourage people to, number one, do that basic lodge work that you need to do, which will make it so much less stressful to go after grants. Go after grants in your local community. You can use the same organizational information to apply for sponsorships, which are not grants, they're sponsorships. But once you have that information, it's there and it just needs to be updated. A comment on the New Asia Foundation. Sue, I saw your comment on that. Here's my recommendation. There are many, many established community foundations in every city that we are in. Go to those foundations because they want to work with the AAPI community. Don't limit yourself to organizations like the Asian American Foundation. It's all well and good, but what we really want to do is, again, going back to my earlier slide, there is more to grants than just simply getting funding. It is about building our voices. It's about being heard. It's about building relationships across cultures. You have to invite and educate people who do not think, look, or eat like us. And there is, in American philanthropy, there is a boatload of money right now that I constantly get phone calls for saying, how can we work with the Chinese community? Okay, and I think, I don't know if you're on, Helen, but Stephen's on. That is true, at least in the state of Oregon. Now, Oregon, granted, is fairly white over the years, but it's all of a sudden, all the philanthropic foundations are very cognizant of diversity, equity, inclusion. So let's get our voices out there. And I am happy to answer by email. Unfortunately, I'm not fully retired and I'm in a rather stressful time frame as a first responder on COVID right now for our organization. So if you could email me, I promise I'll get back to you within a couple of days. If there's a deadline that you're dealing with, please in the subject put time sensitive or put deadline so that I process about 100 and some 50 emails off of. It's just a little bit overwhelming for me right now, but grants is not. I've done it for a long time. We've been successful. Another thing is, how do you know your measure? Well, if you can get 9 out of 11 grants, that's a 5-star rating. If you can get 50% of what you're writing for, that's about normal. If you get none and you've written 10 grants, call me. So that's about the way you can evaluate the grant writing. It is, it is an effort, especially if there's a language. A lot of times there's a language transcreation that happens because some of us may think in Chinese, but write in English, and then the message is being read by, frankly, a white program officer, and is it understood? So I'm just being very frank about it. Have someone edit and review your grants. Any other comments? I know there's a lot of stuff in chat. I like to hear from other people, and I don't know what time it is. Oh my gosh, it's 12:01, Melanie.
Gloria, I think what I will do is I will be making this week's presentations. I'll be putting them all into a Google Drive, and I'll be sending a link out to all our conference attendees so that they can view all the presentations. And also this particular session is being live streamed on YouTube. So, and will be archived on the CACA channel, YouTube. So please, go back to the YouTube, watch it again, because it's a lot of information. It's a lot of valuable information that I think it would be helpful for many of us, me included, to watch again. So
Okay, I just want to answer one last question. Sue, you said that New Mexico, you did survey the foundations in New Mexico, and a lot were not interested in AAPI. My suggestion to you too is find your favorite Native American organization in New Mexico, especially in the arts arena, and find a project you can collaborate on. That'll get you in the door. There's so many indirect routes around things that, and Sue, that's not to say it'll work. It's just what popped into my mind because I used to be with the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, and there's a ton of funding in New Mexico for Native arts.
Okay. We are in the 5th year of the Albuquerque Chinese American Film Festival. So we have a track record, but I do want to follow up, and I don't know if this is going to be successful, what Elaine Wong said in Phoenix. I'm going to approach some of the casinos because, as you well know, a lot of Asian Americans tend to go to casinos. So I'll see how successful we are here in Albuquerque, because Elaine has been pretty successful in Phoenix with casinos. And so not a grant, just a
sponsorship. Yeah, but a lot of,
yeah.
Here, there are grants available from Native tribes, but but mostly sponsorships, which is great, which is fine.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right, so I think we're at time. We do have a really quick break right now until 12:15. I will be ending this meeting, the Zoom meeting. And our next one is the power of telling our stories using the art. So I hope to see everyone on that presentation in about 10 minutes. All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you.